The click of the alligator leather shoes on the rain-slicked pavement was a metronome marking out a rhythm of immense wealth and profound boredom. Arthur Pendleton felt the city's pulse as a distant, irritating thrum, a chaotic symphony he had long ago paid to insulate himself from. But today, he was walking. His driver, a stoic man named Thomas, who had perfected the art of being invisible, followed at a crawl in the obsidian black Bentley, a silent, armored shadow. Arthur had dismissed him with a curt wave. He needed the grit, the grime, the unfiltered stench of humanity. He needed to feel the sickness again, to confirm the diagnosis he had made years ago about the world and everyone in it. A fine, needle-like drizzle began to fall, kissing his tailored charcoal suit, each drop a tiny, cold reminder of the world's indifference. He clutched the lapels of his coat, a gesture less about the cold and more about holding himself together. He was a man made of meticulously assembled pieces, and he feared that one day the glue would simply dissolve. The corner of 8th and Elm was a confluence of human currents. Harried business people, with their eyes locked on some distant prize, weary shoppers burdened with bags, a street performer whose saxophone wept a lonely, ignored blues. This was the spot. It was perfectly, wretchedly average. Arthur took a deep, theatrical breath, as if steeling himself for a performance. He allowed a slight, calculated stumble, his ankle twisting just so. It was a movement he had practiced in the privacy of his penthouse, a convincing facsimile of human frailty. As he pitched forward, his hand shot out from his pocket, not to break his fall, but to release its precious cargo. The wallet, a thick, decadent rectangle of Florentine leather, stuffed to bursting, arced through the damp air. It landed with a soft, wet slap on the pavement, a sacrificial offering to the god of greed. The sound was negligible, yet it was louder than a gunshot. The world stopped for a fraction of a second. Eyes, dozens of them, swiveled from phones, from storefronts, from the gray sky, and locked onto the dark leather. Then the world exploded. It wasn't a riot. It was something worse. It was an unspoken, instantaneous consensus. The social contract, that thin veneer of civilization, evaporated in the misting rain. A man in a delivery uniform was the first to lunge, his knee skidding on the wet ground. A woman in heels, her face a mask of desperate hunger, clawed at his shoulder, her sharp nails leaving white trails on his jacket. A teenager with headphones, still blasting tinny music, dove head first into the burgeoning scrum. There was no shouting, only the grunts and gasps of exertion, the wet slap of bodies colliding, the frantic scrabbling of fingers on concrete. They were not people anymore. They were a single organism, a writhing, multi-limbed creature whose only instinct was to possess. Arthur, now propped on one elbow on the cold ground, watched with a cold, triumphant ache in his chest. "See?" he whispered to the uncaring city. "See what you are?" He had performed this experiment 3 times before, in London, in Tokyo, in Dubai. The result was always the same. A beautiful, ugly, predictable confirmation of his deepest held belief, that beneath the thin shell of politeness and law, every soul had its price, and it was usually shockingly low. But then he saw her. On the periphery of the chaos, standing perfectly still under the awning of a closed newsstand, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8. She wore a bright yellow raincoat, a beacon of defiant color in the monochromatic scene. Her face, framed by damp, dark hair, was a portrait of pure, unadulterated confusion. She wasn't looking at the wallet. she was looking at him. Her brow was furrowed, not with judgment or desire, but with concern. While the world fought over his money, this small child, this statistical impossibility, was looking at the fallen man. The grunting pile of humanity finally broke apart. A single victor, clutching the wallet and sprinting down a side street, the others glaring after him with the fury of the cheated. The brief, intense storm was over. The losers brushed themselves off, their faces reverting to the sullen masks of urban anonymity, and melted back into the flow of the city, as if nothing had happened. The rain began to fall harder. Arthur remained on the ground, the cold seeping into his expensive suit. His eyes locked on the little girl in the yellow coat. She took a hesitant step toward him, then another. She wasn't approaching a millionaire. She was approaching someone who had fallen. In her small hand, she clutched something he hadn't seen fall, a single, slightly crumpled photograph that must have slipped from the wallet in the chaos. She stopped a few feet away, her expression a mixture of shyness and solemn duty. "Are you okay, mister?" she asked, her voice small but clear, cutting through the noise of the traffic. Arthur couldn't answer. For the first time in over a decade, he was utterly, completely speechless. His grand, cynical experiment had just produced a result he could not compute, an anomaly that threatened to shatter the very foundations of his miserable, gilded world. The little girl extended her hand, offering him the photograph. He looked down, and his breath caught in his throat. It was a worn, faded picture of his wife and daughter, taken on a beach a lifetime ago, their faces bright with a kind of uncomplicated happiness he had forgotten could exist. He was so stunned, he didn't realize Thomas had pulled the Bentley to the curb, the back door open, a large black umbrella held aloft. The chauffeur's face was a perfect blank, betraying nothing, but his eyes darted from his employer on the wet ground to the small child in the bright coat. Arthur pushed himself up slowly, his joints aching with a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. He looked at the girl, really looked at her. Her coat was clean, but worn at the cuffs. Her small rubber boots had a patch on one toe. She was not a child of privilege, yet she had offered him concern when others had offered only avarice. He reached out and took the photograph, his fingers brushing against hers. Her skin was warm. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice a hoarse croak he didn't recognize. He fumbled in his inner coat pocket for his money clip, a platinum band holding a sheaf of $100 bills. It was an automatic reflex. A problem arises, you apply money. A service is rendered, you pay. He pulled out a bill and offered it to her. The girl looked at the money, then back up at his face, and her expression changed. The concern was replaced by a flicker of something else. Disappointment. It was a subtle shift, but it hit him like a physical blow. She shook her head, a small, firm gesture. "My mommy says you don't take money for helping people," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "It's not helping if you get paid." And with that, she turned and walked away, her yellow coat a receding sun in the gray afternoon, disappearing into the crowd. Arthur stood frozen, the $100 bill in his hand, becoming a flimsy, meaningless piece of paper. Thomas cleared his throat softly. "Sir, you're getting soaked." Arthur didn't seem to hear. He was watching the spot where the girl had vanished, his mind reeling. The experiment was ruined. Or perhaps it had just truly begun. He got into the car, the scent of wet wool and rich leather filling the space. He slumped against the seat, the photograph held tightly in his hand. He looked at the smiling faces of his dead wife and daughter, then at the empty street outside. His carefully constructed world, his fortress of cynicism built on a foundation of grief, had just been breached by a 7-year-old girl in a patched-up pair of boots. "Thomas," he said, his voice flat, "find her." Thomas, ever the professional, simply nodded, his eyes meeting Arthur's in the rearview mirror for a brief moment. "Of course, sir. Do we have anything to go on?" Arthur looked down at his empty hand, the $100 bill now a damp, crumpled mess on the floor mat. "No," he said, a strange, unfamiliar feeling stirring in his chest. It felt terrifyingly like hope. "Nothing at all." The hunt began with the cold, impersonal efficiency that defined Arthur's life. He didn't deploy private investigators or shady contacts. He started with the city's own eyes. From his penthouse, a sterile glass box overlooking the sprawling metropolis, he and a team of his sharpest corporate analysts, men and women more accustomed to hostile takeovers than missing children, began combing through municipal surveillance footage. The city was wired, a network of digital nerves, and Arthur had the influence and the financial leverage to make those nerves twitch for him. They started with the intersection of 8th and Elm, cross-referencing feeds from traffic cameras, storefront security systems, and even the ATM across the street. It was a painstaking process. Hours bled into a day, then 2. The analysts, fueled by catered food and the unspoken pressure of Arthur's obsessive presence, worked in shifts. They were a pack of digital bloodhounds, sifting through terabytes of data, looking for a flash of yellow in a world of gray. Arthur barely slept. He sat in his leather chair, the faded photograph on the polished mahogany desk in front of him, the only object in the room with any warmth or history. He watched the screens, his eyes burning, replaying the moment over and over in his mind. The fall, the swarm, the stillness of the girl. Her words echoed in the silent, air-conditioned room. "It's not helping if you get paid." He had built an empire on the principle that everything and everyone could be bought. His life was a series of transactions, a ledger of calculated exchanges. He sponsored charities for the tax benefits and the public image. He gave bonuses to inspire loyalty, which was just another word for dependency. He had funded wings of hospitals and universities, his name carved in stone, but he had never once simply helped. The concept was alien, a language he didn't speak. Why had she refused the money? Poverty, he knew from his market research, was a powerful motivator. $100 to a child like that, to a family like that, should have been a windfall, a tiny miracle. Yet she had looked at it with disdain. She had judged him, and in her judgment, he had been found wanting. It was infuriating. It was captivating. On the 3rd day, they found her. A grainy image from a camera half a block down from the incident. The yellow coat, a small figure walking beside a woman. They tracked the pair, camera by camera, a breadcrumb trail of pixels, leading them deeper into the city's less glamorous quarters. They followed her through crowded markets, past dilapidated storefronts, and into a neighborhood of aging brick tenement buildings. The digital trail went cold at the entrance to a building called the Regent, a name that was a cruel joke. The brick was crumbling, the fire escapes rusted, the windows dark and grim. There was nothing regal about it. Arthur stood, his reflection a ghost in the panoramic window, overlooking the glittering city skyline. The Regent was down there, lost in the shadows of the skyscrapers, a world away. "That's it," he said, his voice raw from disuse. "That's where she lives." One of his analysts, a young, ambitious man named Peterson, swiveled in his chair. "We can run a check on the building's residents, cross-reference with school districts, for a child matching her approximate age. We'll have a name and apartment number within a few hours." Arthur shook his head. "No." Peterson looked confused. "Sir? No more data, no more surveillance," Arthur said, turning from the window. He picked up the photograph of his family. "I'm going there myself." The decision was illogical, inefficient. He could have sent Thomas. He could have sent a lawyer with a carefully drafted offer of assistance. But this was different. This wasn't a transaction. He needed to understand the why of her. And he knew, with a certainty that unsettled him, that the answer couldn't be found on a spreadsheet or a background check. He needed to see her world. The next morning, Arthur Pendleton did something he hadn't done in 20 years. He dressed himself, not in a bespoke suit, but in a simple pair of dark trousers, a gray cashmere sweater, and a plain black coat. The clothes felt alien on his skin, too soft, too anonymous. He looked in the mirror and saw a stranger, a man stripped of his corporate armor. He looked older, more vulnerable. He drove himself, taking a modest electric sedan from his collection instead of the Bentley. The journey from his high-rise to the Regent was a descent through the city's social strata. The gleaming glass and steel gave way to concrete and brick. The boutique shops and Michelin-starred restaurants were replaced by bodegas and laundromats. The air itself seemed to change, growing thicker, heavier, filled with the smells of street food and exhaust fumes. He parked a block away from the building, feeling conspicuous despite his plain clothes. He sat in the car for a long time, watching. He saw children playing on the cracked sidewalk, their laughter echoing off the brick walls. He saw a woman helping her elderly neighbor with a heavy bag of groceries. He saw a group of men gathered on a stoop, sharing a newspaper and a heated debate. It was a community, a vibrant, living thing. His own building had residents, but not neighbors. They passed in the hallways with silent, averted eyes, each locked in their own private, sterile world. Here, life spilled out onto the street, messy and loud and interconnected. He finally got out of the car, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. He felt like an intruder, a tourist in the land of the real. The lobby of the Regent was small and smelled of damp plaster and disinfectant. The linoleum on the floor was cracked, and a single flickering fluorescent bulb cast long, dancing shadows. There was a panel of buzzers on the wall, names written on faded paper slips. He didn't know her name. He had come all this way on an impulse, with no plan. He was about to turn and leave, to retreat to the safety of his calculated world, when the front door opened and a woman came in, juggling a bag of groceries and a small child on her hip. She smiled a weary but genuine smile at him. "Can I help you?" she asked. He recognized her instantly from the surveillance footage. It was the woman who had been walking with the girl in the yellow coat. She was younger than he'd expected, perhaps in her late 20s. There were tired lines around her eyes, but her expression was open and kind. I'm looking for someone," Arthur stammered, feeling like a fool. "A little girl. She wears a yellow raincoat." The woman's smile tightened slightly, a flicker of maternal protectiveness in her eyes. "That sounds like my Lily." Why are you looking for her?" The question hung in the air, heavy with suspicion. Who was this well-dressed man asking after her daughter? Arthur knew his appearance, even in his dressed-down state, marked him as an outsider. He held up the photograph. She returned this to me a few days ago. I fell, and she helped me. I just wanted to thank her properly." He hated the lie, the simplification of his complex obsessive quest into a simple gesture of gratitude. But the truth was too insane to articulate. The woman's eyes softened as she looked at the photo of his family. She saw the grief in his face, the raw emotion he usually kept so carefully hidden. She shifted the child on her hip. "You must be the man from the corner of 8th, she said. "Lily told me about you. She said you look sad." Sad. Not rich, not powerful, not clumsy. Sad. The child's simple, devastatingly accurate assessment cut through all his layers of pretense. "I am," he admitted, the words tasting strange in his mouth. "I'm Sarah," the woman said, extending her free hand. "And this little monster is Leo. Lily's at school right now." Arthur shook her hand. Her grip was firm. "Arthur," he said, "it's a pleasure to meet you, Sarah." The encounter felt surreal. He was standing in a rundown lobby talking to a woman named Sarah, having been led here by an act of inexplicable kindness from her daughter. His world of boardrooms and stock prices felt like a distant dream. Would you like to come up for a cup of tea?" Sarah offered, seeing the lost look in his eyes. "You look like you could use one. Lily will be home in an hour." It was an invitation born of simple, unadorned decency. It was not a networking opportunity or a strategic alignment. It was a cup of tea. Arthur Pendleton, the man who could buy and sell entire companies before breakfast, found himself nodding. "Yes," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'd like that very much." Sarah's apartment was on the 4th floor, and the building's elevator had a handwritten "out of order" sign taped to its doors, yellowed with age. They took the stairs. The stairwell was dimly lit and smelled of cooked cabbage. Arthur, who hadn't climbed more than a single flight of stairs in decades, found himself winded by the time they reached her door. He was struck by the physical reality of her life, the daily, unthinking exertion it required. Her apartment, number 4B, was small. A tiny kitchen opened into a living area that also served as a dining room. A worn but comfortable-looking sofa was pushed against one wall, a colorful, handmade Afghan draped over its back. The furniture was old and mismatched, but the space was impeccably clean and filled with a sense of warmth that his own vast penthouse entirely lacked. There were children's drawings taped to the refrigerator, a stack of library books on a small table, and a pot of cheerful-looking geraniums on the windowsill. It wasn't a space for showcasing wealth. It was a space for living a life. Sarah set Leo down on the floor, where he immediately began playing with a set of wooden blocks and went to the kitchen to put the kettle on. "I'm sorry for the mess," she said over her shoulder. "With 2 of them, it's a constant battle." Arthur looked around. "It's not a mess," he said honestly. "It's a home." He sat on the sofa, the springs creaking in protest. He felt oversized and awkward, a bull in a china shop. He looked at the drawings on the fridge, bright, chaotic explosions of color. One depicted a smiling sun, another a wobbly-looking house with a stick-figure family out front. Sarah brought him a mug of tea. It was chipped at the rim. The tea was a simple tea bag brand, nothing like the rare, single-estate blends he imported. It was the best thing he had tasted in years. "Lily is a very special girl," he said, holding the warm mug in his hands. Sarah smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that lit up her tired face. "She is. She has a bigger heart than anyone I know. She worries about everyone." She sat in a rocking chair opposite him, Leo babbling at her feet. "She told me she was worried about you. She said all the other people were like angry animals, but you just looked lost." Lost. Another direct hit from the vocabulary of a 7-year-old. He had spent his life cultivating an image of impenetrable control, of being the master of his universe. A child had seen through it in an instant. "I was," he confessed. "I have been for a very long time." They sat in a comfortable silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the ticking of a clock on the wall, the gurgling of the baby, and the distant wail of a siren. It was a kind of peace he hadn't experienced since before the accident, before his wife and daughter were taken from him, before the money became a shield he used to keep the world at bay. He learned about Sarah's life in small, unassuming pieces. She was a nurse's aide at a nearby convalescent home, working double shifts to make ends meet. Her husband, a construction worker, had died 2 years prior in a workplace accident, leaving her with 2 small children and a mountain of debt. She spoke of her struggles without a trace of self-pity, stating them as simple facts of her existence, like the weather. There was a quiet strength in her, an unbreakable dignity that Arthur found both humbling and intimidating. He wanted, instinctively, to fix her problems. He could pay off her debt with the loose change in his car's cup holder. He could buy this entire building and give it to her. The impulse was overwhelming, the familiar urge to solve a problem with a checkbook. But he remembered the look on Lily's face when he'd offered her the $100 bill. He remembered her words, so he just listened. He asked her about her work, about her children, about the geraniums on her windowsill. He learned that Lily loved to read and dreamed of being a veterinarian, and that Leo had just started walking. He was engaging in a conversation that had no agenda, no desired outcome other than the conversation itself. He was connecting. The sound of a key in the lock made them both turn. The door opened, and there she was. Lily stood in the doorway, her yellow coat dripping slightly onto the floor mat. She was holding a school bag covered in cartoon characters. She froze when she saw him, her eyes wide with surprise. "Mister," she whispered. Arthur's heart did a strange, painful lurch. He stood up slowly. "Hello, Lily." Sarah went to her daughter, helping her off with her coat and bag. "Arthur came to thank you for helping him, sweetie." Lily looked from her mother to Arthur, her expression cautious. She walked over to him, stopping a few feet away, just as she had on the street. She looked him up and down, taking in his different clothes, his presence in her home. "You don't look so sad anymore," she declared. Arthur let out a short, surprised laugh. It was a rusty, unfamiliar sound. "That's because of you, Lily," he said, and he was astonished to find that it was the absolute truth. "You helped me." Lily considered this with the gravity only a child can muster. Then she gave him a small, shy smile. "Do you want to see my book?" she asked. "It's about a lost star who finds his way home." Before he could answer, she ran to the small bookshelf and returned with a well-worn picture book, its cover soft from countless readings. She climbed onto the sofa next to him, her small body radiating a warmth that seeped through his cashmere sweater and into his very bones. She opened the book, and as he sat in that small, clean apartment, with a baby playing on the floor, and a little girl reading to him about a lost star, Arthur Pendleton felt something shift deep within him, a tectonic plate of grief and cynicism that had been locked in place for a decade, finally beginning to move. He felt, for the first time in a very long time, like he might be finding his way home, too. The visits became a ritual. Twice a week, Arthur would drive the modest sedan to the crumbling brick building that housed the brightest part of his world. He never came bearing extravagant gifts. He had learned his lesson. Instead, he brought things that required thought, things that spoke a language other than money. He brought a rare, out-of-print book about deep-sea creatures for Lily, having remembered her fascination with a documentary she had mentioned in passing. He brought a special orthopedic toy for Leo, designed to help with his motor skills, something he'd had his research team spend a day sourcing. For Sarah, he brought gourmet coffee beans, a small, affordable luxury he knew she would never buy for herself. Each offering was a quiet apology for the man he had been, the man who had tried to pay for kindness. He became a fixture in their small apartment. He would sit on the creaking sofa, which now seemed to welcome his weight, and listen. He listened to Lily's animated stories about her school day, the complex politics of the playground, the profound injustice of having to eat broccoli. He listened to Sarah's tales from the convalescent home, stories of the small dignities and quiet despairs of the elderly. Stories she told with a compassion that humbled him. In turn, they learned about him, not about Arthur Pendleton, the corporate titan, but about Arthur, the man. He told them about his wife, Eleanor, who had been a passionate art historian. He told them about his daughter, Chloe, who had her mother's laugh and a mischievous spirit. He spoke of them in the present tense at first, a slip of the tongue that Sarah never corrected. He found that talking about them with Sarah and Lily didn't reopen the wound in the same agonizing way. It was more like tending to a long neglected garden, clearing away the weeds of bitterness to find the beautiful, resilient flowers of memory underneath. One rainy Saturday, he arrived to find the apartment in a state of quiet panic. A pipe under the kitchen sink had burst, and a steady stream of rusty water was pooling on the linoleum. Sarah was on her knees with a bucket and a stack of towels, her face etched with worry. "The building superintendent is on vacation until Tuesday," she said, her voice tight with stress. "I can't get a plumber to come out on a weekend without it costing a fortune. I don't know what to do." The old Arthur would have had his assistant on the phone in seconds, a team of the city's best plumbers dispatched, the bill paid before the first wrench was turned. The problem would have been erased by wealth. But the new Arthur saw not just a logistical problem, but a woman's feeling of helplessness. He saw her fear of a bill she couldn't pay, a fear he had never once had to consider. He rolled up the sleeves of his expensive sweater. "Where's your toolbox?" he asked. Sarah looked at him, bewildered. "My what?" "Toolbox," he repeated. "Wrenches, pliers, that sort of thing." "I have a hammer and a screwdriver," she said, gesturing to a drawer. Arthur sighed. He walked over to the sink, crouched down, and peered into the dark, damp cabinet. The gushing water was coming from a corroded joint. It wasn't a complicated fix, but it required the right tools. "Stay here," he said to Sarah. "Keep bailing. I'll be right back." He drove not to his penthouse, but to the nearest hardware store. The place was a cathedral of practicality. He walked the aisles, surrounded by people who built and fixed and maintained their own worlds. He felt a sense of inadequacy, a man who could orchestrate a billion-dollar merger, but had no idea what size washer a sink faucet required. He asked a clerk for help, a grizzled older man with calloused hands and a patient demeanor. Arthur described the problem, and the man nodded, leading him through the aisles, explaining the difference between a pipe wrench and a basin wrench, showing him how to apply plumber's tape. Arthur bought a full, high-quality toolbox, filled with everything he could possibly need. He paid in cash. Back at the apartment, he laid out his new tools on a towel on the kitchen floor like a surgeon preparing for an operation. Lily watched him, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Are you a plumber, Arthur?" she asked. He chuckled. "No, Lily, I'm just a man with a new wrench." It was messy, difficult work. The cabinet was cramped. The corroded nut refused to budge, and at one point a spray of cold, rusty water hit him directly in the face. Sarah and Lily giggled, and Arthur, after a moment of shock, found himself laughing with them. It had been years since he'd laughed like that. A real, uninhibited laugh that came from the gut. It took him nearly 2 hours, but he finally managed to remove the old pipe, clean the threads, and install the new one. He turned the water back on slowly. There were no drips, no leaks, just the satisfying silence of a problem solved. He stood up, his knees aching, his sweater stained with rust, and a smear of grease on his cheek. He had never felt more accomplished. Sarah looked at the repaired sink, then at him, her eyes shining with a gratitude that was more profound than any thank you he had ever received for a multi-million-dollar donation. "I don't know how to thank you, Arthur," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved us." "You don't have to thank me," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. I think I'm the one who was saved." That evening, they ate dinner together at the small kitchen table, a simple meal of pasta and salad that Sarah had prepared. It was more satisfying than any of the elaborate catered meals he usually ate alone in his silent penthouse. As they ate, Lily looked at his hands, now clean but for a few scrapes and a bit of grease under his fingernails. "You have working hands now," she said seriously. Arthur looked down at his own hands. They were the hands of a man who had signed contracts, who had shaken hands on deals, who had typed memos that could make or break fortunes. But they had never worked, not in this fundamental, tangible way. They had never stopped a flood. They had never fixed something that was broken. "Yes, Lily," he said softly, a lump forming in his throat. "I suppose I do." He was beginning to understand. Helping wasn't about giving from a distance. It wasn't about writing a check and outsourcing the solution. It was about showing up. It was about getting your hands dirty. It was about sharing in the vulnerability of a problem and the triumph of its solution. The wallet, the experiment, the cynical question he had asked the world, it all seemed like a foolish game from another lifetime. The world wasn't a monolith of greed. It was a collection of individuals. It was a tired mother trying to keep her apartment from flooding. It was a little girl who saw sadness instead of wealth. It was a man with calloused hands in a hardware store who took the time to explain the purpose of a wrench. His view of the world had been a panoramic shot from a penthouse window, wide but shallow. Now he was seeing it from the ground floor, One person, one leaky pipe, one shared meal at a time. And the view from down here, he realized, was infinitely more vast and beautiful. The change in Arthur was not a sudden, dramatic metamorphosis, but a gradual erosion of his old self. The fortress of solitude he had built around his heart was being dismantled, brick, by the small, persistent hands of a child, and the quiet, unwavering dignity of her mother. His own world, the world of Pendleton Industries, began to notice. Peterson, the ambitious young analyst, was the first to comment. "You seem different, sir," he remarked one afternoon, after Arthur had spent a board meeting arguing against a profitable but ethically dubious factory relocation plan that would decimate a small town's economy. The old Arthur would have seen only the bottom line, the elegant math of profit and loss. The new Arthur saw the faces of the people who would lose their jobs, the families that would be uprooted. He saw Sarah and Lily. "I'm just acquiring a taste for a different kind of portfolio," Arthur had replied, leaving Peterson utterly baffled. He started leaving the office at 5 o'clock, an act so unprecedented that it sent ripples of shock through the corporate headquarters. He no longer spent his evenings poring over market projections. Instead, he would be at a local park, pushing Leo on the swings, or sitting on a bench, helping Lily with her math homework. He discovered the simple, profound joy of being needed for something other than his money. One afternoon, he took Lily to the city's Natural History Museum. He had a wing there named after him, the Pendleton Hall of Paleontology, the result of a massive donation he'd made years ago. He had attended the lavish opening gala, shaken hands, smiled for the cameras, and never returned. Walking through it now with Lily was a completely different experience. She darted from exhibit to exhibit, her face alight with wonder, bombarding him with questions he couldn't answer. Why did the T-Rex have such tiny arms, Arthur? Was he sad about them? He found himself looking at the towering skeletons, not as assets he had acquired, but through her eyes, as magical, terrifying creatures from a lost world. As they stood before the massive Tyrannosaurus Rex skeleton, Lily pointed to the small brass plaque at its base. "Look, that name is the same as yours." He had forgotten it was there. It read, "Donated by the Arthur Pendleton Foundation." Lily looked up at him, her head tilted. "Is that you?" He nodded, a strange feeling of embarrassment washing over him. "A long time ago, yes." "You bought a dinosaur?" she asked, her eyes wide. "In a way," he said. "Do you still have him?" The question was so absurd, so wonderfully childlike, that he laughed. "No, Lily. He belongs to everyone now." She seemed to approve of this. "That's good," she said. "It's better to share. It's better to share." Another simple truth from the mouth of a child, chipping away at his lifelong belief in the primacy of ownership. He had spent his life acquiring things, companies, buildings, art, even dinosaur bones, but he had never truly shared anything. He had only ever bought, sold, and possessed. Later that week, Sarah received a letter that turned her world upside down. It was a final notice of foreclosure on the apartment building. The owner, a faceless real estate conglomerate, had sold the property to a developer who planned to demolish it and build luxury condominiums. All tenants were to be evicted in 60 days. The news ripped through the Regent like a shock wave. The community Arthur had come to observe from a distance was now in crisis. He saw the fear in Sarah's eyes when she told him, a raw, primal fear of homelessness that he had only ever read about in newspapers. He saw the confusion on the faces of her neighbors, people he now knew by name. Mrs. Garcia from 3A, whose son was serving overseas. Mr. Chen from 2B, who ran the small bakery on the corner. These were not statistics on an eviction notice. They were lives about to be shattered. His first instinct, the old, powerful reflex, was to write a check. He would buy the building. It would be a simple matter, a rounding error in his vast fortune. He would solve the problem with a single phone call. He even picked up his phone, his thumb hovering over the number for his personal lawyer. But then he looked at Sarah. He saw her pride, the same pride that had made her daughter refuse his money. If he simply bought the building, he would become her landlord, her benefactor. He would be trading her immediate fear for a long-term dependency. He would be a benevolent king, and they would be his grateful subjects. He would be robbing them of their agency, of the very dignity he had come to admire so much. He put the phone down. "We're going to fight this," he said. Sarah stared at him. "How? It's a done deal. We're just little people." "There's no such thing," Arthur said, a conviction in his voice that surprised them both. "There are only people who have been told they're little for so long they start to believe it." This was a problem he couldn't fix with a wrench. But he had other tools, sharper and more powerful than any he had found at the hardware store. He had knowledge of the system, of the intricate machinery, of law and finance and power that was currently crushing this small community. For the first time, he would use that machinery not to accumulate more for himself, but to defend those who had nothing. He called a meeting in the building's small, shabby community room. At first, the residents were suspicious of this stranger in their midst, this well-dressed man who spoke with the calm authority of the world that was trying to evict them. But Sarah stood by his side. "He's a friend," she said simply, and that was enough. Arthur didn't make grand promises. He explained the situation in clear, simple terms. He laid out the legal notices, the corporate filings of the developer. He translated the dense legalese into human language. Then he laid out a plan. He would provide the best tenant rights lawyers in the city, pro bono. He would fund a media campaign to bring public attention to their plight. He would use his own corporate research team to dig into the developer's finances, to find points of leverage. "But," he said, looking into the faces of the worried residents, "I cannot do this for you. We have to do this together. You are the face of this fight. Your stories are the most powerful weapon we have." For the next 60 days, the small apartment in 4B became a war room. Arthur was there every day, not as a commander, but as a strategist and a resource. He worked side by side with Sarah, Mrs. Garcia, and Mr. Chen. He taught them how to organize a tenants association, how to draft a press release, how to speak to reporters without being intimidated. He saw a fire ignite in them, a transformation from victims into advocates. Sarah, in particular, blossomed. The quiet, weary nurse's aide found a voice she never knew she had. At a press conference on the steps of City Hall, she spoke with an eloquence and passion that moved even the most jaded reporters. She didn't speak of legal statutes or zoning laws. She spoke of her children, of her home, of the community that was a lifeline for a single mother. She spoke of the fear of being uprooted, of having her children's lives thrown into chaos. Arthur watched from the back of the crowd, completely invisible, feeling a sense of pride that was deeper and more real than any stock market victory. He was not the story. He was helping them tell their own. The fight was brutal. The developers were a faceless Goliath, armed with an army of lawyers who used every dirty trick in the book. They issued threats. They tried to buy off tenants. They smeared the residents in the press as deadbeats and squatters. Through it all, Arthur remained the calm center of the storm. He countered their legal moves, he anticipated their strategies, and he used his immense network to open doors that would have remained firmly shut. He called in favors from journalists, politicians, and business leaders, not for his own gain, but for the residents of the Regent. He was spending his social capital, the currency he valued almost as much as his financial wealth, on a group of people the world had deemed disposable. One evening, exhausted after a long day of legal depositions, he was sitting on the sofa in Sarah's apartment. Lily came and sat beside him, leaning her head against his arm. She had been quiet throughout the turmoil, sensing the stress in her mother but not fully understanding its source. "Are you going to lose your home, Arthur?" she asked in a small voice. The question took his breath away. She didn't ask if she was going to lose her home. She asked if he was. In her mind, he belonged here now. This worn-out sofa, this small, warm room, this was his home, too. "No, Lily," he said, putting his arm around her. "None of us are. I promise." It was a promise he wasn't sure he could keep, but as he said the words, he knew he would liquidate his entire fortune before he let it be broken. The turning point came from an unexpected direction. Arthur's research team, digging through mountains of financial records, found a vulnerability. The development project was being financed by a consortium of banks, including one with which Pendleton Industries had a massive, long-standing relationship. Arthur requested a meeting with the bank's CEO, a man named Marcus Thorne, whom he had known for years. They met, not in a boardroom, but in a quiet corner of an old wood-paneled club. Marcus was affable, confident, the picture of financial power. "Arthur," he said, shaking his hand warmly, "good to see you. I trust your portfolio is weathering the current market jitters?" "My portfolio is fine, Marcus," Arthur said, getting straight to the point. "We need to talk about your investment in the Regent property on Elm Street." Marcus's smile became a little more fixed. "A minor development project. Good ROI. I can't imagine it's of interest to you." "It is of immense interest to me," Arthur said, his voice quiet but cold as steel. He laid out the situation, the community, the families, the ethically questionable tactics of the developer. Marcus waved a dismissive hand. "It's just business, Arthur. Progress. The city needs to evolve. You, of all people, should understand that. I understand that your bank is about to become the public face of a campaign that will be defined by corporate greed and the victimization of the poor," Arthur said calmly. "I understand that several major pension funds, with whom I have some influence, have strong ethical investment clauses, and I understand that Pendleton Industries is scheduled to renew its 9-figure credit line with your bank next month." He let the words hang in the air. It wasn't blackmail. It was business. The same cold, hard language Marcus understood. He was using the tools of his old world to protect his new one. Marcus Thorne stared at him, his affable mask falling away, to reveal the shrewd calculator beneath. He saw that Arthur was not bluffing. The potential loss of the Pendleton account, coupled with the public relations nightmare, was a risk far greater than the profit from one small real estate deal. "What do you want, Arthur?" he finally asked, his voice strained. Arthur leaned forward. "I want you to pull your financing. But that's not all. I have a proposal." An hour later, Arthur left the club. He walked for several blocks, in the cool night air, not toward his car, but just walking, feeling the city's energy. He had not destroyed any enemy. He had created a solution. A week later, another meeting was held in the community room at the Regent. This one was not about fighting, but about building. Arthur stood before the residents, Sarah at his side. He announced that the developer, having lost its financing, had abandoned the project. A cheer went up in the small room, but he held up a hand for silence. "That's not all," he said, a rare smile on his face. "A new, anonymous buyer has purchased the building, and this new owner has a different plan." He explained that the building would not be sold. Instead, it would be turned into a non-profit housing cooperative, owned and managed by the tenants themselves. Rents would be frozen, and any profits would be reinvested into renovating and improving the building. Furthermore, the new owner was providing the seed money to establish the co-op, along with funding for job training programs and an after-school tutoring center for the children, to be housed in the now vacant ground floor retail space. The residents were stunned into silence, then erupted into a joyous, tearful celebration. They crowded around Arthur, shaking his hand, hugging him. He was no longer an outsider, a strange benefactor. He was one of them. In the midst of the happy chaos, Lily tugged on his sleeve. He leaned down. "Did you buy the dinosaur building, Arthur?" she whispered. He looked into her bright, knowing eyes. She had seen through his anonymity, just as she had seen through his sadness. "Yes, Lily," he whispered back. "I guess I did. And you know what? You were right. It's much better to share." He stood up and looked across the room at Sarah. She was watching him, her face radiant with a mixture of joy, relief, and something else, something deeper. Their eyes met, and in that shared glance there was an understanding that transcended friendship, a recognition of the profound journey they had taken together. The fight for the Regent was over, but Arthur knew his own work was just beginning. He had saved a building, but the experience had rebuilt him. He established a new kind of foundation, one that didn't just put his name on buildings, but invested directly in communities, providing not just money, but the tools for empowerment, legal aid, financial literacy, strategic support. He became a pioneer in a new kind of philanthropy, one that was messy and hands-on and deeply personal. His penthouse, once a symbol of his isolation, now frequently hosted strategy sessions with community organizers from across the city. His corporate boardroom, once a temple of pure profit, now had a permanent, non-voting seat reserved for an ethics advisor, a position he gave to a retired social worker he'd met through Sarah. He had not abandoned his wealth. He had repurposed it. He had found its true value, which had nothing to do with the numbers on a screen and everything to do with the lives it could touch. One sunny afternoon, about a year after the fight for the Regent, Arthur was sitting on a newly installed bench in the small park across the street from the building. The Regent itself was transformed. The brick had been repointed, the windows replaced. The rusted fire escapes were now painted a cheerful blue, with flower boxes adorning every railing. It was the same building, but it radiated a newfound sense of pride. and hope. He was watching Lily and Leo play on a new playground, its construction the first project funded by the co-op's reinvestment fund. Sarah came and sat beside him, handing him a cup of coffee from Mr. Chen's bakery. "Look at them," she said, her voice soft with contentment. "They're happy. They feel safe." "So do I," Arthur said, surprising himself with the admission. For the first time since he'd lost his family, the gnawing emptiness inside him was gone. It had been filled, not with a replacement for his grief, but with a new sense of purpose. He was no longer a man haunted by the past, but a man building a future. Sarah rested her head on his shoulder for a moment, a comfortable, companionable gesture. Their relationship had settled into a deep, loving friendship, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared experience. There was an unspoken promise of something more, but they were in no hurry. They were healing together. Arthur reached into his coat pocket. He no longer carried a wallet stuffed with cash. He had a simple card holder and a money clip with a few small bills. But he did carry one thing. He pulled out the faded photograph of his wife and daughter, the one Lily had returned to him on that rainy day. Its edges were soft, its surface crisscrossed with creases from the countless times he had held it. He looked at the smiling faces, and the familiar pang of loss was still there, but it was no longer a sharp, unbearable agony. It was a gentle ache, a reminder of a love that had shaped him. Then he pulled out another photograph, a more recent one. It was a picture Thomas had taken a few weeks ago, on a trip they had all taken to the beach. It showed Arthur, Sarah, Lily, and Leo, all of them laughing, squinting in the bright sun. Lily was on his shoulders, her small hands tangled in his graying hair. He looked at the two photographs, holding one in each hand, the past and the present, the family he had lost and the one he had found. He hadn't replaced them, he realized. He had simply made his heart big enough to hold them all. Lily, seeing him with the pictures, ran over, her face flushed from playing. "Who are they?" she asked, pointing to the old photo. "That was my wife, Eleanor, and my daughter, Chloe," he said, his voice steady. "She looks like you," Lily said, touching Chloe's face on the picture. "Her eyes are smiling." Arthur's throat tightened. "Yes," he said, "they are." Lily then pointed to the new photograph. "And that's us," she said happily. "That's our family." She said it so simply, so matter-of-factly. She leaned in and gave him a quick, sandy kiss on the cheek, then ran back to the playground, her laughter trailing behind her. Arthur looked at Sarah, his eyes misty. She was smiling, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. He gently placed the old photograph on top of the new one and slid them both back into his pocket, together. He had started with a bitter experiment to prove the world's greed, dropping a wallet full of money onto a cold, indifferent street. He had lost the wallet, but in the end, he had gained the entire world.